as of Monday, Jon Gruden has officially resigned as the Las Vegas Raiders head coach. There's an obvious investigation that went into the Washington football team regarding sexual misconduct allegations a few years ago. Bruce Allen, who is one of their higher ups there, I believe was the team president at the time, was a good friend of Jon Gruden. Now, as good friends tend to do, they shot a lot of emails back and forth. They had a lot of conversations, and some of those conversations were very derogatory. And those emails leaked. Now, the first one that leaked was the one regarding DeMaurice Smith, where Jon Gruden felt the need to mention DeMaurice Smith's lip size. Fast forward, Jon Gruden apologizes for the incident, and then several more emails leak. One of which had some not great things to say about Roger Goodell. Another had some terrible things to say about NFL female officiating. Michael Sam, that may be a name blast from the past, but that name came back into public relevance. Jon Gruden eventually, I think just to avoid the PR hit, decided, I'm going to call it a day. I'm done here, because he didn't officially get fired, which I think is a good detail to mention, because it makes you wonder. I think obviously that's him sacrificing the rest of his contract, which is about $60 million on a remaining 6 more years at $10 million a pop for the Raiders. So might be a safety net for Mark Davis there. What did you think of this whole situation when it first came out, Kyle?
So from a PR standpoint, because this is an important distinction that I wanted to bring up on the podcast, is separating this from the lazy tropes of, stereotyping racist, homophobic, misogynistic comments, where even racist, homophobes and misogynists agree what Jon Gruden said was racist, homophobic, and misogynistic. We don't really need to argue that side of it. So separating that from the PR aspect of this situation, where if it's just the DeMaurice Smith email, Jon Gruden is going to survive this, because he can stand up in front of the locker room and explain that one away, and people will give him the benefit of the doubt. At the very least, we all wanted to believe in the goodness of Jon Gruden. I think his players included, as well as us just looking from the outside, that this was not something with racist intent. This was just something that had to do with, I think Gruden's explanation was that he calls everyone who lies rubber lips. So we wanted to believe that in the goodness of Jon Gruden. And I think from a PR standpoint, they could have accepted that and walked away. When you have 7 years of emails knocking out 5, 6, 7 different minority groups, that's when this is who you are, or who you were, not in the not that distant past. And so that one, there was no way Jon Gruden was going to be able to get through that. I think there's going to be a lawsuit no matter what, even with the resignation. I think Gruden's agent was probably working with the ownership and the Raiders front office to figure out what sort of compensation package it would be in exchange for Gruden resigning. We already know that the Raiders are facing potential bankruptcy because they have a lot of financial issues dating back to their time in Oakland, and then the funding of the Las Vegas stadium and the move and all that stuff is putting the Raiders in financial strain. So that's already a problem there. So I think there was no way Gruden was ever going to be able to walk back into that locker room. Just from a PR standpoint of the Raiders organization, did not have this information in the past. Now they have this information and they have to evaluate it under that circumstance. So, and they would have decided to move on from Jon Gruden, even if Jon Gruden doesn't resign. I don't know if Gruden recognized that it was over and he, both were on the same page, or the Raiders had to inform him that it was over. I don't know what the conversations were there. I was listening to Sally Jenkins of the Washington Post today, and she was talking about who could have leaked the information to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And there's a few interesting cases here. It could be someone within the Washington organization who potentially wanted revenge towards Bruce Allen, who, as you mentioned, was their team president, I believe, for 12 years. He was the president of the Washington football team. It could be someone within the NFL Players Association who are now calling for the release of all of the emails pertaining to the Washington football team story. It could be someone within the investigative team who's frustrated by the progress of the investigation, because it is technically an NFL investigation. So take all of it with a grain of salt. The NFL ultimately protects their own interests, and Roger Goodell works for Dan Snyder. He's one of his 32 bosses, even though apparently, like, for the last 16 months, Dan Snyder hasn't been running the Washington football team. They've kind of just turned the franchise on autopilot and kind of told Dan Snyder that you can't be involved in the day-to-day operations while they're investigating. But still, Dan Snyder is, for now, technically one of Roger Goodell's bosses. So maybe there's someone within the investigation that leaked it, or the weird conspiratorial one, which is the NFL leaked it because there is a lot of bad information that is going to come out. And so if they distract us with this little bit of news about Jon Gruden or news about Adam Schefter having journalistic credibility issues, and that's the stuff we can eat up, and Jon Gruden takes the fall, maybe we can protect Dan Snyder a little bit more. And maybe, just maybe, Dan Snyder gets to keep his team instead of being forced to sell, like what happened with Jerry Richardson and the Carolina Panthers with all the Me Too stuff that surrounded that. So all of that to say, this was something that was a logical conclusion. It's unlike anything I've seen in the last 10 years of being able to kind of understand this stuff. And it's a really interesting situation that we will now pivot into talking about the Raiders as a football team outside of, because that's the nature of football, right? Is that the Raiders are going to have to move on as a franchise and as a team. And just like the last 20 years of Raiders history, it feels like the Raiders just get, kicked in the behind. Whenever something good happens, all of a sudden, everything you thought was good and well about the first real identity the Raiders had of the last, well, really since Al Davis died, you have an identity of the Raiders outside of the son that has a terrible bowl haircut. It's not what you thought it was. And now you're looking around and thinking, where are you at this point? Because the Raiders are still a pretty good football team. It's just that now they have to act as most teams do when your coach gets fired, which is like, are we punting on this season? Can we rally around this? Do we want to rally around each other? It's a weird situation that's going to be weird to talk about given everything that's going on with the organization.
It's definitely been a turbulent week for the Raiders. When you think about game blown out on Monday Night Football, then you have the loss against the Bears, you have the first email leak, and then obviously you end in Jon Gruden's resignation. I think the resignation gets a lot weirder when you talk about the fact that he had the most secured coaching deal that we've ever seen also in our lifetimes. That 10-year deal is just not something you see an NFL coach ever get. And it was obviously because of the close relationship between Mark Davis and Jon Gruden. I've heard conspiracy theories saying, yes, this was the NFL leaking this because they not only want to get Gruden, but eventually they want to tie this back to Mark Davis because they want him out of there. Now, that is a theory because obviously Mark Davis, you mentioned the financial troubles of the Raiders. Would they like to get someone like a Jeff Bezos in there, or someone with more high esteem that has outside interests outside of football to elevate this new Las Vegas venture? Now, that's neither here nor there. That's all hearsay at the moment. You talked about wanting to give Jon Gruden the benefit of the doubt, and I did. I really did, coming off of the first initial set of comments, whether it be the rubber lip thing. Now, I should say this beforehand. I obviously disavow anything that Jon Gruden said, the totality of it, everything in a vacuum. But we'll go through each kind of like statement one by one and where I kind of was on initially looking at this story here. When it came to the DeMaurice Smith stuff, is he saying this about DeMaurice Smith, the black man, or is he saying this about DeMaurice Smith? Is he targeting him? Yes, obviously, he talked about someone's lip size when they are a black man is a racial trope, and that is something that we should steer away from behavior-wise. But mocking someone's physical appearance, while again not acceptable, doesn't necessarily mean that he has any kind of pure racial prejudice, maybe just a prejudice against DeMaurice Smith. Okay, the Roger Goodell one. So calling Roger Goodell a pussy, as far as that word, it's just one of those 7 dirty words you don't say on television. I'm sure Roger Goodell has seen tweets, has seen emails, has seen calls, has seen fans, coaches, players all say that and worse stuff about Roger Goodell. I'm sure Tom Brady called Roger Goodell a pussy several times after the Deflategate scandal. But when we start getting into the other thing he was calling Roger Goodell, And that's one I won't say on this podcast. It's
yeah,
just not
but
one
for people who don't know the story, it's the F word that's a slur for someone who is gay.
Yes.
So that's the word that was used, just for context. Because Chris Mortensen did a story where he put explicit in there and we didn't know exactly what it was, but just for context, that's what word he used.
For context, yes. Obviously, it's one that I wouldn't use. It's not one that I've ever felt comfortable saying in any context. But if you go into an Xbox Gamers Lounge, it's definitely one that gets thrown around freely. I think I once heard Bill Burr in a comedy skit say, if you walk down a street in Boston, you called it 3 times before you reach the end of the block. Now, 10 years ago, was it slightly more of an acceptable vernacular? Again, not saying it's right, not saying it's a great word to use, but was it used a little bit more freely back in the day? It was. You say that. Now, here's where I think is where it really starts getting into fireable. When you start talking about the female referees, because the NFL is not going backwards. They're not going back to a time where there's no female referees. So if you have any kind of negative connotations towards that type of hiring, the NFL is not going to stand by you.
The NFL would like to get to a place where they're hiring not just female coaches, but like multiple female head coaches in the league. That's the direction that Goodell and other people at the top have actually like made public, that that's somewhere that they'd like to move towards.
Exactly. So the NFL is not going backwards in that regard. So you coming after that group is one that Roger Goodell and the NFL is not going to stand for. You could call Roger Goodell a pussy all day, but if you start questioning his move to get the more diversity in the NFL, that's where he's going to give a little bit of pushback. Another one, obviously, talking about Michael Sam, talking about Jeff Fisher, the exact comment, this one's a little less explicit, but still not great, saying that he felt the NFL and Roger Goodell were forcing the Rams to draft, as he called it, queer players. This is especially bad for the Raiders head coach, considering that Carl Nassib, who actually took a personal day today, I saw that was a story today, you were showering him with praise in the offseason. But if you're Carl Nassib, don't you have to think that's all fake now? Don't you have to like look at that and think, wow, this guy is literally calling out the idea of a openly gay player getting drafted. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, I kind of came out openly gay this year, which is something that I kept very closet identity the previous couple of years of knowing Jon Gruden. How do I know that this last 4 or 5 months since I made my announcement wasn't just a phony for the cameras type of, kind of show, all for show kind of thing?
Yeah. And the thing that I think I've been proud of sorts, which is, again, weird connotation given that pride means something different in this context. But the thing that made me feel good was that we have people in the media who are not making this all about like, what does Carl Nassib say as a representation of the LGBTQ community around Jon Gruden? I'm glad that we haven't done that so far, because Carl Nassib was not openly gay until this year, yet he'd been in football locker rooms for 15 years in his life. Carl Nassib has encountered hundreds of people with similar beliefs to Jon Gruden, people who have probably said it out loud many a times in a football locker room, even still today. Like, there are lots of people who think privately the same things that Jon Gruden does. One of them was coaching the Browns playoff game last year when Kevin Stefanski got COVID. There are people in the league that have this idea. So I'm glad that we haven't gone to that point in like treating Carl Nassib as like he is the representation for the LGBT community in this conversation, because that's not fair to Carl Nassib. It's lazy on our part for trying to get like just a quote that we can throw out there as a representation for what do LGBTQ plus people think about the Jon Gruden situation. So to that point, maybe Carl Nassib did need a personal day, and that's all good. Like, that's Carl Nassib's way of processing it. I'm glad we're just not pressing him on it and adding more pressure than needs to be around this situation.
All those combined factors are why, yes, Jon Gruden couldn't be the Las Vegas Raiders head coach anymore. But as far as how we can view Jon Gruden moving forward, is he a racist, sexist, homophobe? That is kind of like one of the things that people want to talk about with him moving forward. We had this conversation like in 2016, right? When the famous Trump grab him by the pussy tape came out, which is locker room talk. obviously Jon Gruden, in the context of these conversations, thought he was just talking to his good buddy, Bruce Allen. And I guess this is where it comes down to like guys and the way we talk. Like when we think we're just talking with buddies, is it toxic? Is that go back into that phrase like toxic masculinity? It can be. It can obviously be. There's always this showing off, this boisterous nature that guys have, like to be bigger than their buddy. My roommate put it a great way. How many times have you told one of your friends, I fucked your mom? Have you ever fucked one of your friends' moms? Vice versa. Has any of your friends fucked your mom? I hope not. That should not be a thing. But I think this, guys always try to talk bigger than life or try and like talk shit. And when they think they're in a private conversation, and now, it kind of makes you wonder, like anything you put in writing, you have to wonder if that's ever going to bite you in the ass one day. Like, this is a private email chain. Yes, it came out and, we found out the context of it, and it ended up in a result that, well, obviously not great for Jon Gruden, his family, everything of that nature, his future in television. Obviously, you can't even go back to ESPN after this to host Monday Night Football. That's just not an option anymore. But, we found out a little bit of a nature of a person in a higher power, kind of like how they thought behind the scenes. Okay. But it does kind of like worry me. I know this is an argument too, the slippery soap type things. Like, have you ever been shitty in a Facebook group chat? I'm sure I have.
Me personally, probably not in the same way, but I've seen people all the time who interact in that way. But I just don't see that as much anymore. And that maybe it's a generational thing, or maybe it's the fact that I live in a very much more progressive state and go to a school where most people are quite progressive. Like that's maybe just a generational difference around that. But I've been in locker rooms before. I've heard people say racial slurs and racial taunts before. Like, I think this is going to go away more than we would want it to, maybe with Jon Gruden specifically. Like, I think this is going to vanish and we're not going to learn the lessons around this of like, these are things that still very much exist. These are old tropes and stereotypes that, yes, as older people who grew up around language of toxic masculinity, which is a lot of comedy that's punching down at people who've been oppressed across generations. And yes, that's starting to fade out slowly but steadily as we live in a social media world, and we live in a world where you can be held accountable for these types of things. And we ourselves think about how we've acted in the past when we see people like Jon Gruden take the fall, and generally just the world gets more progressive as young people won't stand for this stuff anymore.
It does. But one thing that kind of came to my mind, start of COVID, when we saw all those public freak out videos and everyone was in a surge to get people fired, is these people don't just go away, do they? Like we get them fired, we get them canceled. They still exist within our society. Like, how do we move forward? What is the proper way to reintegrate these people? Because do we just say like Jon Gruden, walk away, you're a racist, you're a homophobe, transphobic, whatever you are, go in that corner and we never hear from you again? Is that a proper way to progress as a society?
I think that these are larger scale issues. So like one of the ways to do it is in criminal conduct situations, reforming our court system to create better accountability. Potentially, like Jon Gruden, ultimately his punishment is that he's no longer allowed to work in the NFL. And in the grand scheme of things, that's not a terrible punishment. Like he still gets to have a lot of money. He still gets to have a lot of privilege, and he still gets to go do something else with his connections and his resources. There needs to be some level of accountability. I think this is what has changed in a quote unquote cancel culture era, is that we can hold people somewhat accountable. Now, there are going to be growing pains around this. Some people are going to be punished too harshly, and some people are going to be punished too leniently. There's going to be growing pains as we figure all this stuff out. But I think the thing I've adapted on this is just holding people to some level of accountability. And this happens on a much grander scale when we talk about the fact that Bill Cosby has his freedom right now, or the fact that Harvey Weinstein was looking like he might be freed after everything that happened with him. Like, these are larger scale issues that extend outside of sports, and sports has versions of that as well that are, when we talk about things that are more intense than saying a racial slur, such as committing a hate crime or committing murder, that are gross and we don't know exactly how to handle it as a society. These are
Yeah.
things that we just want some level of accountability. And when there isn't a level of accountability in systems that we've set up to give us accountability, all of a sudden we turn to like, well, maybe we can prevent you from making money or doing this job that you love. I mean, connected to Deshaun Watson and Trevor Bauer within sports, they're still making all their money. They're not going to prison at all. Their punishment is just they're not allowed to do this thing. They're not allowed to work is the only punishment we can hand down at this point, is just for your conduct. The only thing we as a society can do is put pressure on you and shame you enough to make it so that you're not able to work for some extended period of time. In terms of what is an appropriate level of time for Jon Gruden or an appropriate level of punishment for Deshaun Watson, I'm not the person to answer that question in this situation. I am a white straight man. I'm not the person who should be doling out the punishments on
You mean
this
you're
one.
not the moral arbiter of the world, Kyle?
No,
I thought I was
should not
mistaken. God, when I brought you on the Slumpbuster team, I thought that was the guy that I was bringing on. No, hey, listen, yeah, that is a question that's much bigger and grander than us two on this podcast that maybe people are listening to, maybe people aren't. But I think it is a question that we do have to answer eventually as a society, because it does seem like we get mad at these people for the day. And yes, you mentioned Jon Gruden. Yes, you mentioned he has money, he has resources. It's not going to truly impact him in the same way that it would impact someone who had one bad day, a Karen moment gets put on YouTube, and then they're just gone from society. That is one of the things that I question as we move forward. That's one of the things that I want to know the answers to as we progress. And did Jon Gruden have to be the one that took the fall in this one, be the fall guy for this situation? Yeah. It just makes you think, like, if you've ever said something shitty, if you ever said something reckless, then maybe it just kind of like time to reflect, because this is kind of, I'm not a huge faith-based guy, but I should say this is like one thing. There's that old story about not casting the first stone unless you're clean. I think that we have to answer those questions. Are we truly clean, to be casting dispersions on the guy, like outside of the fact that he's already gone outside the NFL? That's my one thing.
It's a slippery slope. And to be honest, like from where I stand right now, I think Jon Gruden is going to work again. Like it might be years down the road, but I do think Jon Gruden, if he wants to, can work again. Now, might Jon Gruden decide, okay, I'm going to go do something else. I've got net worth of $70 million. I'm going to go be a philanthropist. I'm going to go be an entrepreneur. Maybe that's what Jon Gruden wants to do with the rest of his life. Like, this is a question he'll have to ask himself.
Going into the locker room, that can't happen. Once you have those tags thrown on you, whatever those tags, those ist tags, they don't come off, really. They really don't. Like, the internet has a short memory, yes, but there's names from the past that we still think of in that kind of way. Like I mentioned, like someone like a Chip Kelly, like even though his was very loose, there wasn't really much to stick to him as far as people were throwing out racial issues with him. That followed him around to this day. People still mention about it every now and then. So
I'll give you 3 examples around that right now, just real quick. So one is Art Briles, who is not allowed to coach anymore. We've decided that Art Briles still has not, served his punishment of sorts. Is that because of everything that happened at Baylor and a university that turned a blind eye to sexual assault across many years, Art Briles still is not allowed to be someone who is working with young people and in a position of power. Hugh Freeze, which is a less serious accusation. This is more of like a violating NCAA rules type of situation. It took him a couple of years, but he was eventually allowed back in. And the third one is Rick Pitino. Rick Pitino had a couple weird things in his past and NCAA violations and stuff. And then Strippergate happened, and they basically told him, sorry, Rick, you got to go. He wanted to keep coaching basketball. That's where he draws his identity. And maybe that's where Rick Pitino stands at this point. And now he's going on the long rehabilitation tour to Greece and now coaching at Iona in upstate New York. People will compromise morals even to beat Idaho State in football. I think even if it's like a Division II school, someone will come through and give Jon Gruden a job, because people who have done worse have also gotten these jobs. Now, was Jon Gruden's more public than most people? Yes, but I think that's just the nature of the job that Jon Gruden was working, being outside of Bill Belichick, I think the second highest paid coach in the NFL up to this point. So I think just the nature of that is going to let Jon Gruden back in at some point. When that'll be, again, I'm not the moral arbiter on this. Maybe he won't come back in, and maybe Jon Gruden decides he doesn't want to coach again. But I think over time he will be forgiven. And to your point before about we need to sort this out in some kind of way to like find out what is fair and appropriate punishment for bringing people who are, I'm putting this in air quotes, canceled back into society. I think it's just going to be more trial and error. And hopefully the systems around that can set up an accountability measure so that we don't have to do so much public shaming of people who come from a previous generation or come from, again, lazy, racist, stereotypically homophobic, misogynistic.
I think part of me trying to be the devil's advocate here is I think it is too easy to be in the pile on culture. I think that that's one of the things. Yes, we run a meme page too. I should say that. So we pile on occasionally, but I think that, and it would be easy for myself. It would be a lot easier for myself to be on the pile on crowd here, But,
so one of the things I talked about on Take It Easy on Tuesday was the other story that was going on in the meme world simultaneously, which is jokes about Jackson Mahomes and Brittany Mahomes on the internet. And I look at that and I'm like, these are just lazy stereotypes that you're doing right now. You're basically just telling someone with a famous husband and she is not famous, shut up, you are a woman. And you're basically
a gold digger. Yeah, I've seen all that stuff.
Then for Jackson Mahomes' TikToks, people are being antagonistic towards LGBTQ plus people, even though Jackson Mahomes is not gay. He's just doing TikTok dances and has a somewhat high-pitched voice. And so people are being antagonistic because this is the stereotype. Like, I'm just saying people basically are being lazy and saying, LOL, that's gay. I don't like that. Stop doing that. And it's just lazy stereotypes that unfortunately larger meme pages with more clout than even you and I are making the same jokes. And it makes me disappointed to see it, because I was doing some of the stuff with Juju Smith-Schuster last year and like playing into it because it was easy content. And I feel like disappointed that I made those jokes. I realize now that, those jokes are kind of playing into bad stereotypes, and I don't partake in those anymore. The Gruden joke I made is making fun of Dan Snyder, because that's punching up instead of punching down. It's better to make jokes that way than it is to play into the piling on of Jon Gruden or Carl Nassib or making jokes about women kind of thing. Like what people would call edgy memes, which is, again, we're doing football content here. You don't need to be edgy in terms of making fun of women, LGBTQ plus people, or non-white people.
It's funny you mentioned kind of like the LOL, that's gay. I think that's, again, kind of like goes into how language has continued to evolve as well. Like the fact that saying LOL, that's gay, like 10 years ago, or when I was growing up, certainly like was not really that much of a thing. It was like for you to say, that's dumb, that's stupid, that's whatever. But now obviously we kind of know that it has a different meaning, and, it does kind of offend people. So now I've curbed that behavior. And, if you're like someone randomly posting on Twitter, you have to think about stuff like that. You have to know that, like, if you're maybe going for a job hire, we're talking about this for a guy that's making $100 million a year, but for you have to be more monitoring of kind of stuff you say openly and publicly. You have to adapt as well with the times. And I think that's one of the things that we could probably take away from this situation, is kind of like learning behavior as well. All right.
And I was just going to say, even when I was in middle school and high school, like people would say that all the time, but I think back then we just didn't really care. Like, we kind of knew if we were talking to someone who we knew was gay, we weren't going to make gay jokes. When we were talking to someone who was a girl, we're not going to make misogynistic jokes. But then when you have people from similar backgrounds all together, that's when all of a sudden real character comes out, because people feel like you can say it without having any repercussions for it. And that's where toxic masculinity and everything that we've been talking about kind of festers out. I think it still exists today. I think it's just the best way to do it is to bring people from different backgrounds together, to have not just one gay friend, but multiple gay friends, and having multiple friends that are not the same race, gender, sexual orientation as yourself. And that's actually the best way I've learned how to not be in these situations, or find myself seeing someone be antagonistic and realizing there aren't repercussions for it. And then just be an ally for those people. It's important that people in the majority voice the minority opinion, because that's how society is going to get better in the long run.